Picture this. You've just been accused of stealing a loaf of bread to feed your starving family. Within hours, you're dragged through muddy streets by iron shackles that cut into your flesh with every... The smell hits you first, a nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting flesh and despair so thick you can taste it on your tongue. Welcome to medieval prison, where justice wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about making you wish you'd never been born. Think modern prison is tough. Think again. Medieval confinement was a masterclass in human suffering, where the goal wasn't to reform criminals, but to break them completely, piece by piece, until nothing remained of their former selves. These weren't correctional facilities designed to help people reintegrate into society. They were human storage units, designed to extract confessions through sheer misery, psychological torture, and systematic dehumanization. And if you think you know what medieval imprisonment looked like from movies and TV shows, prepare to have your assumptions completely shattered by the brutal reality that history textbooks conveniently skip over, sanitize, or simply refuse to acknowledge. Before we dive headfirst into this historical nightmare that will make your worst anxiety dreams seem like pleasant daydreams, make sure to subscribe to The Medieval Truth for more shocking revelations about the past that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you take for granted, from running water to basic human rights. The first thing you need to understand about medieval prisons is that they weren't really about punishment in the way we think of it today. They were torture chambers disguised as holding cells, designed by minds that viewed human suffering as both entertainment and divine justice. The medieval mind operated on a simple, terrifying principle. If you were accused of a crime, you were probably guilty until proven innocent, and the only question was how much suffering it would take to make you confess to whatever crime they needed you to admit. Innocence was a luxury that few could afford, and even fewer could prove. Take the Tower of London, perhaps the most infamous medieval prison in history, whose very name still sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with its blood-soaked history. While tourists today see ancient stone walls and imagine romantic tales of imprisoned princes writing poetry by candlelight, the reality was far more sinister and soul-crushing. The tower's dungeons were designed with one purpose: complete psychological breakdown through systematic isolation and terror. Prisoners were often held in complete darkness for months at a time, their only human contact coming from guards who spoke to them only to deliver threats, demands for confession, or descriptions of the tortures awaiting them if they continued to resist. The isolation was so complete and devastating that many prisoners began talking to the rats that shared their cells, treating these disease-carrying vermin as their closest companions and confidants. They would name the rats, share their meager food rations with them, and even create elaborate conversations to maintain some semblance of sanity in their crumbling minds. Guard reports from the period describe prisoners who had developed entire relationships with imaginary cellmates, speaking to empty air for hours and becoming violently agitated when guards interrupted these conversations with reality. But the Tower of London was absolute luxury compared to most medieval prisons scattered throughout Europe. In smaller towns and villages, prisons were often nothing more than holes in the ground, covered with wooden planks and secured with iron bars. These oubliettes, from the French word meaning to forget, were exactly what they sound like, places where people were literally forgotten by society, abandoned to die slowly in darkness and filth. Prisoners were lowered into these pits by rope and left there until they died of starvation, confessed to whatever crimes their captors demanded, or went completely insane from the isolation and horror of their situation. There was no trial date to look forward to, no appeals process to navigate, no hope of release based on good behavior or new evidence. You simply ceased to exist above ground, becoming a ghost that haunted the nightmares of your family, while your body slowly wasted away in a stone tomb designed for the living dead. Some oubliettes were so deep that prisoners could hear conversations from the street above, but could never make themselves heard, creating a special kind of psychological torture where the sounds of normal life became a constant reminder of everything they had lost. The living conditions in these medieval hellholes would make a modern maximum security prison look like a luxury resort, complete with room service and cable television. Sanitation was not just non-existent, it was actively harmful to human health. Prisoners relieved themselves where they slept, ate, and spent every waking moment, creating a toxic stew of human waste that bred disease like a medieval biological weapon. The floors were covered in inches of accumulated filth that had built up over years, creating a breeding ground for rats, insects, and bacteria that would make modern scientists recoil in horror. The air was so thick with the stench of decay, excrement, and rotting flesh that visitors often vomited violently upon entering, and guards would tie cloth soaked in vinegar around their faces to avoid passing out from the smell. Many prisoners developed permanent respiratory problems from breathing this poisonous atmosphere day after day, their lungs slowly filling with infection and their bodies weakening until they could barely stand. Rats weren't just unwelcome companions. They were dining partners, competitors for survival, and sometimes the only source of fresh meat available when prison food ran out completely. These rodents grew fat and bold in the prison environment, often attacking sleeping prisoners to feed on their flesh, creating infected wounds that never properly healed in the unsanitary conditions. Some prisoners reported being awakened by rats gnawing on their fingers and toes, and the more desperate inmates would catch and eat these same rats raw, creating a horrific cycle of survival that pushed human beings to their absolute breaking point. Now let's talk about the food situation, because calling it food is being extremely generous to substances that would be considered biological warfare by modern standards. Prison meals consisted of whatever scraps the guards felt like throwing into the cells, often leftovers from their own meals that had already started to spoil. Moldy bread crawling with maggots was considered a feast worthy of celebration, and prisoners would fight each other viciously for the privilege of eating these writhing morsels of protein. Water was often green with algae and teeming with parasites, drawn from the same sources used for sewage disposal, but prisoners had no choice but to drink it or die of dehydration. Many prisoners developed severe dysentery that left them barely able to stand, adding to the already overwhelming stench and unsanitary conditions of their confinement. The truly horrifying part wasn't that prisoners were dying from starvation and disease within weeks of their arrival. It was that this wasn't considered a failure of the system, but rather the system working exactly as intended by its cruel designers. Guards would sometimes withhold food for days as punishment for perceived infractions, or simply for their own amusement, watching prisoners grow weaker and more desperate as they slowly starved. The psychological impact of never knowing when or if your next meal would come was often more devastating than the physical effects of hunger, creating a constant state of anxiety and desperation that broke down mental resistance more effectively than any torture device. But here's where things get even more twisted and morally reprehensible. Medieval prisons operated on a fee-for-service basis that would make modern healthcare billing seem reasonable by comparison. That's right, prisoners had to pay for their own imprisonment, creating a system where poverty became a death sentence and wealth could buy you relative comfort even in the depths of a dungeon. Want a blanket to survive the freezing winter nights that killed dozens of prisoners each year? That'll cost you a significant portion of your family's savings. Need clean water instead of the stagnant pond water that caused deadly infections? Better have coin to spare and family members willing to bankrupt themselves for your survival. Want to avoid being chained to the wall in a position that would permanently damage your spine and joints? Time to negotiate with your captors and hope they were feeling merciful that particular day. Those who couldn't pay were given the absolute worst treatment available, crammed into the most overcrowded and disease-ridden sections of the prison, where death was not just likely but almost guaranteed within months of arrival. This created a nightmarish hierarchy within prison walls that reflected and amplified the social inequalities of medieval society. Rich prisoners might have private cells with actual beds, regular meals prepared by their own servants, and even access to books and writing materials to help pass the time. They could receive visitors, maintain correspondence with the outside world, and essentially buy their way to living conditions that, while still terrible by modern standards, were palatial compared to what their fellow inmates endured. Meanwhile, poor prisoners were crammed together in overcrowded dungeons where the strong survived by preying on the weak, creating a brutal social ecosystem where violence was the only currency that mattered. These unfortunate souls would be chained together in groups, forced to sleep standing up or curled against each other for warmth, sharing diseases and parasites with an efficiency that would impress modern epidemiologists. Political prisoners with powerful connections could essentially run their own operations from within prison walls, receiving regular updates on outside events and sometimes even conducting business through intermediaries. Some wealthy prisoners hired other inmates as personal servants, creating a bizarre economy within the prison system where human dignity could be bought and sold like any other commodity. The interrogation methods used to extract confessions make modern police questioning look like a friendly chat over coffee and pastries. Medieval jailers had developed an extensive arsenal of techniques designed to break the human spirit without necessarily killing the prisoner, though death was always an acceptable outcome if confession proved elusive. These methods were refined over centuries of practice, passed down from one generation of torturers to the next like family recipes for human suffering. Sleep deprivation was standard practice and considered one of the more humane options available. Prisoners were kept awake for days on end through a combination of physical discomfort, loud noises, bright lights, and direct intervention by guards until they were so delirious they would confess to anything just to make the torment stop. Guards would take shifts to ensure the prisoner never got more than a few minutes of rest, creating a state of exhaustion so complete that hallucinations became indistinguishable from reality. Starvation was another favorite tool in the torturer's arsenal, with prisoners given just enough food to keep them alive, but too weak to offer physical resistance to questioning. This technique was particularly effective because it slowly stripped away the prisoner's mental defenses along with their physical strength, making them increasingly desperate and willing to say anything that might result in a meal. Then there were the more creative approaches to confession extraction that demonstrated the truly twisted ingenuity of medieval minds. Prisoners might be forced to stand in freezing water for hours until their feet turned blue and their entire body shook uncontrollably, or hung by their wrists until their shoulders dislocated and their arms stretched beyond repair. Some were subjected to the water cure, having gallons of water forced down their throats until they nearly drowned, then allowing them to recover just enough to repeat the process again and again until their will to resist completely crumbled. And these techniques weren't considered torture by medieval standards. They were simply enhanced interrogation methods that were perfectly legal and morally acceptable according to the religious and legal authorities of the time. The distinction between legitimate questioning and torture was largely academic, as both served the same purpose and often employed identical methods. One particularly chilling example comes from the detailed chronicles of a 14th century French prison, where a man accused of heresy was kept in a cell specifically designed to prevent normal human posture. The cell was too small for him to lie down flat or stand up straight, forcing him to remain in a perpetual crouch that slowly destroyed his joints and muscles. For 3 long months, he was fed only bread and water, while priests visited daily to demand his confession and describe the eternal torments awaiting him in hell if he continued to resist. By the time he finally broke and admitted to crimes he had never committed, simply to end his suffering, his legs had atrophied so severely that he never walked normally again. He spent the rest of his shortened life as a crippled beggar, serving as a living example of what happened to those who defied the authorities. This wasn't considered excessive punishment. It was seen as merciful compared to being burned alive, which was the standard sentence for confirmed heretics. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval imprisonment was the crushing uncertainty that prisoners faced every single day. Modern prisoners, however flawed the system might be, know their sentences, have access to legal representation, and can appeal their convictions through established processes. They have rights that are at least theoretically protected, and family members who can advocate for them. Medieval prisoners lived in a constant state of terror, never knowing if today would be the day they were dragged to the gallows, subjected to torture for information, or simply forgotten and left to die in their cells. This psychological warfare was often more effective than physical torture in breaking prisoners' will to resist, as the human mind can only handle so much uncertainty before it begins to break down completely. Prisoners would develop elaborate superstitions and rituals to try to predict their fate, reading meaning into every sound, shadow, or change in routine. The arrival of guards at unusual times could signal imminent execution or torture, and prisoners would often confess to crimes they hadn't committed simply to escape the crushing anxiety of not knowing what would happen next. The women's prisons deserve special mention for their particular brand of horror that combined all the standard medieval prison conditions with additional degradations specifically designed to break down feminine dignity and social identity. Female prisoners faced all the standard medieval prison conditions: the filth, the starvation, the disease, the violence, plus additional torments that were considered appropriate for their gender. They were often kept naked or dressed in rags that provided no warmth or modesty, subjected to sexual assault by guards who faced no consequences for their actions, and forced to give birth in the filthy conditions of their cells if they happened to be pregnant upon arrival. The mortality rate for pregnant prisoners was astronomical, and children born in medieval prisons rarely survived their first year of life. Those infants who did manage to survive were often raised as prisoners themselves, knowing no other life than the stone walls and iron bars of their birthplace. These children would grow up stunted both physically and mentally, never learning normal social skills or experiencing the outside world. Some became permanent fixtures in the prison system, serving as servants to guards or entertainment for visitors who found their primitive condition amusing. Female prisoners were also subjected to unique forms of psychological torture based on medieval concepts of feminine virtue and social role. They might be told that their children had died or been sold into slavery, that their husbands had remarried and forgotten them, or that their reputations had been so thoroughly destroyed that they could never return to normal society even if released. Religious prisoners faced their own special hell that combined physical torment with spiritual warfare designed to break their faith and force them to renounce their beliefs. Monks and priests who ran afoul of church or secular authorities were often imprisoned in monastery dungeons where they were subjected to constant religious interrogation by the very brothers they once considered friends and allies. These clerical prisoners were forced to participate in mock religious ceremonies that blasphemed their most sacred beliefs, compelled to renounce their vows and confess to heresies they had never committed, and often tortured by fellow religious figures who claimed to be saving their souls through physical suffering. The psychological impact of being betrayed by their own religious community was often more devastating than any physical torture. Some religious prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for years, given only religious texts that contradicted their beliefs, and forced to write essays explaining why their former faith was wrong. Others were made to serve as examples to other prisoners, publicly humiliated, and forced to renounce their beliefs in front of crowds who had once looked up to them as spiritual leaders. Now let's address some common misconceptions about medieval imprisonment that popular culture has embedded in our collective consciousness. Movies and television shows often portray medieval prisons as places where noble knights were held in relatively comfortable tower cells, playing chess with their guards and writing poetry while awaiting rescue by loyal followers. The reality is that noble birth might buy you slightly better treatment and more comfortable accommodations, but it was absolutely no guarantee of humane conditions or eventual release. Even royal prisoners could find themselves in rat-infested dungeons if they posed a significant political threat to the ruling powers. The Tower of London is filled with the ghosts of nobility who died in conditions just as horrible as any common criminal, their high birth meaning nothing once they were branded as traitors or threats to the crown. Another persistent myth is that medieval imprisonment was a short-term affair, with prisoners quickly tried and either executed or released within a reasonable time frame. In reality, many prisoners languished in dungeons for years or even decades without trial, gradually forgotten by the outside world as political situations changed and their cases became irrelevant to current power structures. Court records from the period, when they exist at all, show numerous cases of prisoners who served decades for minor crimes simply because there was no system in place to review their cases, consider their release, or even remember why they had been imprisoned in the first place. Some prisoners outlived the judges who had sentenced them, the crimes they had allegedly committed, and even the legal systems under which they had been convicted. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the practice of using prisoners as entertainment for the wealthy and powerful members of society. Public executions were common and well documented, but less well known were the prison exhibitions where wealthy citizens could pay substantial fees to tour dungeons and gawk at the prisoners like animals in a zoo or freaks in a carnival sideshow. Prisoners were often forced to perform for these visitors, dancing, singing, recounting their alleged crimes, or even fighting each other for the amusement of their social betters. These exhibitions were considered perfectly normal entertainment, similar to visiting a menagerie or attending a theatrical performance, The prisoners had no choice but to participate, as refusal would result in punishment that made their already hellish existence even worse. Some prisons developed regular touring schedules, with guards acting as tour guides, who would explain the crimes and punishments of various prisoners, embellishing the stories for dramatic effect. Wealthy visitors would sometimes throw coins or food scraps to prisoners who put on particularly entertaining performances, creating a degrading spectacle that reduced human beings to performing animals. The psychological impact of medieval imprisonment extended far beyond the prison walls, creating ripple effects that lasted for generations and shaped entire communities. Those fortunate enough to survive their confinement and gain release were often permanently damaged by their experiences, bearing both physical and mental scars that marked them as former prisoners for the rest of their lives. Many former prisoners became beggars or hermits, unable to reintegrate into society after months or years of dehumanizing treatment that had stripped away their social skills and self-respect. Others turned to actual crime, having learned that society had already condemned them regardless of their innocence or guilt, and feeling that they had nothing left to lose by living up to their criminal reputation. The families of prisoners were also devastated by the medieval justice system, often bankrupting themselves trying to pay for their relatives' prison fees, bribes for better treatment, or legal representation that rarely made any difference in the outcome. Children would grow up in poverty and shame, marked by their association with convicted criminals and struggling to overcome the social stigma that followed them throughout their lives. Medical care in medieval prisons was virtually non-existent, considered an unnecessary expense that served no purpose in a system designed to break rather than heal. Broken bones were left to heal incorrectly, creating permanent disabilities that would mark former prisoners for life. Infections were allowed to fester until they became life-threatening, and mental illness was seen as either divine punishment for the prisoner's sins or demonic possession rather than a treatable medical condition. Prisoners who survived serious injuries often bore the scars for life, serving as walking advertisements for the brutal efficiency of medieval justice. Missing limbs, facial disfigurement, and permanent physical disabilities were common among former prisoners, making it impossible for them to hide their criminal past and reintegrate into normal society. The economic impact of this barbaric system was staggering and far-reaching. Communities lost productive members to a justice system that prioritized punishment over rehabilitation, removing workers, craftsmen, and farmers from the economic system without providing any benefit in return. The social fabric was torn apart by a justice system that created more problems than it solved, destroying families and communities in the name of maintaining order. Even death offered no escape from the cruelty and indignity of medieval imprisonment. Prisoners who died in custody were often denied proper burial according to their religious beliefs, their bodies thrown into unmarked mass graves or left to rot in prison courtyards as warnings to other inmates and examples to the general population of what happened to those who defied authority. Families were forbidden from claiming the bodies of their loved ones, and the locations of these mass graves were kept secret to prevent memorial gatherings that might inspire sympathy for the condemned or criticism of the justice system. Some prisons would simply throw corpses into nearby rivers or feed them to animals, treating human remains with less dignity than most people would show to dead livestock. The guards and administrators who ran these institutions were often criminals themselves, given positions of power over other prisoners in exchange for their cooperation with the authorities. This created a system where the most brutal and sadistic individuals were put in charge of human lives, with predictably horrific results that exceeded even the official policies of the prison system. Guard corruption was not just common but expected, with basic human needs like food, water, medical attention, and protection from violence becoming commodities to be bought and sold. Guards would often provoke fights between prisoners for their own entertainment, place bets on the outcomes, and punish both participants regardless of who started the conflict. So, there you have it, the brutal, unvarnished reality of medieval imprisonment laid bare in all its horrifying detail. A system so cruel and inhumane that it makes modern prisons look like vacation resorts by comparison, and modern complaints about criminal justice seem petty and insignificant. These weren't correctional facilities designed to rehabilitate criminals and return them to society as productive, law-abiding citizens. They were human breaking machines, carefully designed and refined over centuries to crush the human spirit and extract confessions through systematic torture, degradation, and dehumanization. The next time you complain about modern inconveniences, feel like society is too harsh, or think that criminal justice today is somehow unfair, remember the medieval prisoners who spent years in rat-infested dungeons, slowly going insane from isolation and torture, while their families bankrupted themselves trying to secure their release. Remember the innocent people who confessed to crimes they never committed just to end their suffering, and the families who watched their loved ones disappear into a system specifically designed to forget they ever existed. Remember the children born in prison cells who never saw sunlight, the women who were brutalized by the very guards supposed to keep them safe, and the men who were driven to madness by techniques that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. Remember that this wasn't ancient history. This was the standard operating procedure for criminal justice for centuries, and it shaped the legal and social systems that eventually evolved into our modern world. And if this glimpse into the dark history of human justice has left you both horrified and fascinated, if you find yourself grateful for basic human rights that our ancestors could never have imagined, make sure to subscribe to The Medieval Truth for more shocking revelations about the past that will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval life and make you appreciate the civilization we've built on the bones of these historical nightmares. Because sometimes the truth is far more terrifying than any fiction, and understanding that truth is the only way to ensure we never repeat the mistakes of our brutal past.